be with this person's wife and to soften her heart and to guide her to your glory.
Dear God, please be with Post Falls Church as they trying to find another pastor.
Dear God, please be with Gemma as she might be struggling with something.
Dear God, please be with this person's grandpa who has cancer.
Please help this person's grandkids to be able to join Pathfinders.
Dear God, thank you that this person's surgery went well, and please help them to heal.
Dear God, please help and be with this person that wants his grandkids to be part of Pathfinders. Amen.
Go.
Okay. I don't want to mess up twice in a row. That's just bad luck. Or as I call it, just another Tuesday. All right, welcome back, everybody. Hi. Hello. I hope you had a fantastic afternoon. I did. I got to tell you, that fireplace in there, I want one in my house. Yes. There's no room for it. I would not be able to live in my house if that fireplace were in my house, but I want that. Also, maybe don't inhale your own saliva. Wow. It's a good thing that coughing is perfectly fine in this day and age. Otherwise, I might scare you guys. Let's start over. And scene. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's really great to see you guys tonight. I am really excited to be here again, to be talking about ways that we can be very practically helpful to people around us who are having mental health challenges. And today, this evening, we're going to focus specifically on depression and anxiety and some things that result from those and some specific ways to be helpful to folks who are having those. As always, I didn't sort of make this announcement before the last talk, but I hope you picked up. It's totally fine at any point along the way to shoot up your hand, ask a question. We'll just take it all in stride. Does that work for you guys? All right, perfect. Let's dive in. As always, there's the as always part. I have no relevant financial disclosures. Disclaimer done. Here's what I want to learn this evening. I want to learn at least 3 ways to recognize when an adolescent, when a young person might be having a mental health crisis. I stress might be because we're not going to learn how to diagnose tonight. That's a few years longer than we have this evening. But we are going to learn how to recognize some warning signs, and I want you to be able to know at least 3 of them, and I want you to know at least 3 ways to be helpful for each of the following very specific scenarios: panic attacks, a recent traumatic event, and we're also going to talk this evening about non-suicidal self-injury. Okay? Here's how we're going to get there. We're going to do a brief survey of what mental health looks like in our country right now. We're going to review some basics about adolescent development. We're going to review some of the signs of mental health challenges. And then finally, we're going to get to those very specific scenarios that I talked about. Huge thank you to Mental Health First Aid. I am borrowing shamelessly from some of their material this evening. But you guys have already heard me talk about being a fan. Tonight's text comes from Matthew 11:28 and 29, which says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Pray with me, will you? Father, you've made us in some pretty amazing and downright confusing ways sometimes. But thank you for that. Thank you for making sure that life is never boring. Thank you for making sure that you have built into us ways that we can connect with each other, ways that our minds can explore each other, ways that our minds can explore themselves, and more importantly than that even, ways that we can connect with you. Come here tonight, come into this building, come in, connect with us, and let us know that we've had a chance, that we've had a moment with you this evening. Thank you. Amen. I need a third hand. There we go. All right, so let's talk about depression and anxiety. What are they? Well, let me ask you this question. I'm a psychiatrist, and so that means I am a specialist in brain problems, but not every single brain problem, because I don't want to run the neurologists out of jobs. They've got their collection of diagnoses, and I have mine. And mine usually go by the name or the general category of a mental illness or a mental health challenge or a mental disorder. That's usually what we talk about. We sometimes talk about behavioral health, and behavioral health is this really strange term that is supposed to be the combination of, or covering all of the mental health diagnoses and all of the substance use disorders, and we call it behavioral health, as if somehow it's all related. I don't know why somebody came up with that term. It makes no sense to me, but that's what I do. So if you think about all the different mental health diagnoses that you know. All right, so think about those and think about everything they have in common. If you had to come up with a definition of what is a mental health disorder or what is a mental health diagnosis, what would your summary of that be? If I were to look up mental health diagnosis in the dictionary that you wrote, what would it say? Neurodivergence. Say that a little louder. Neurodivergence. Okay. What else? Brain broke. You're going to go with it. We had a hyphenated word. We're going with two shorter words. I like it. What else? What do we got? Dysfunction of the mind. All right, so all of these things, thank you guys. That's really, I think we're very close to that. All of these things have in common that the problem is where in your person? Right between your ears, right? So it's a problem with your brain. And how can I tell that there's a problem with your brain? Please don't say autopsy, that's just morbid.
But it's not wrong.
It is not wrong. It's just morbid. Okay, so it's a problem. How can I tell there's a problem with your brain? Your actions? Okay, so I can watch your behaviors. That's a good one. What else? What else can I watch? Words. I can listen to your language, which tells me a lot about how your brain is thinking and how thoughts are working in your brain, right? So I can look at your thinking and your language. What else?
How you like to speak and how you understand.
Yes. I can pay attention to the way you're processing. How else? Emotions. Absolutely emotions. In fact, some mental health diagnoses get their name from the emotion that's off. Depression, anxiety are two examples right there. Right? So it's a problem with your brain that results in, errors or challenges with thinking, with behavior, or with emotions, sometimes all three. And it interferes, the other thing that it has to do to be a diagnosis, it has to interfere with critical functioning. Otherwise, you're just an interesting person. I mean, no two of us experience emotions exactly the same way. No two of us behave exactly the same way. You are absolutely allowed to be quirky. At least I hope so, because God knows I am. All right? So it's got to result in some interference in things. And the things that we look for in mental health, we look for your major role obligations. So that might be your job or school or something like that. So it might interfere with your major role obligations. It might interfere with your ability to have to do things that are meaningful to you. So whatever that is, your hobbies or pathfinders or something like that. Or it might interfere with your ability to have meaningful relationships. Now that's a lot of words, and I can't ever remember all of those without thinking. So I think of it as it interferes with your ability to live, major role obligations, to laugh, do things that are meaningful to you, or to love, to have meaningful relationships. And so a mental illness is a problem with your brain that interferes with your thinking, your behavior, or your emotions, and interferes with your ability to live, laugh, or love. Got it? There's going to be a quiz. I'm kidding. There's no quiz. But do take notes. All right. Look, we already covered the first slide. We're geniuses. All right, here is what anxiety disorders look like amongst adults. So this is people over the age of 18. This was back in, I think 2016 that we did this survey in the United States of America. And you can see that anxiety disorders are far and away, this is just a 1-year snapshot, this is not lifetime risk. This is just in any given year, what percentage of us meet criteria for an anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder or substance use disorder, and so on down the list. Question, what surprises you about this slide?
Depression is higher?
You thought depression would be higher. Yeah, I agree. Turns out it's not. And part of that is a little bit of fudging here. This major depressive disorder is one kind of depression. It's a very specific, it's the classic kind of depression, versus anxiety disorder refers to a category of disorders. But it turns out that anxiety disorders in general are more common than mood disorders. What else surprises you about this? Schizophrenia is really low on the list, isn't it? I mean, if we were to believe movies and the news reports, we'd think schizophrenia was a lot more common, but it turns out it's really pretty rare. What else?
The bipolar disorder, that one surprised me.
You think it should be higher, lower?
I thought it would be higher.
You thought it would be higher. You thought that maybe more than 3 out of 100 of us would meet criteria for bipolar disorder.
Because some of us have met like 4 or 5.
Right. Some of us are like, my circle of friends is a little bit different. In any given year, about 1 out of 3 of us, ultimately, or here it's closer to 1 out of 6 in this, 1 out of 6 of us meet criteria for a mental health disorder. So if you have 5 friends and none of them have one, just saying. But also please notice that the numbers above the boldface any mental disorder do not add up to 18.5. And that's because if you have one, chances are you have more than one. Having one mental health challenge does not magically protect you from the other ones. As we learned this morning, the things that happen to you that predispose you to developing mental health conditions tend to predispose you to developing more than one kind of challenge, right? Let's look at kids. So now we're going 13 to 18. These are adolescents. And once again, anxiety disorders are right up at the top. And notice here when we're looking at kids, we look at whether you have a diagnosis or whether you have a diagnosis that has a severe impact. Not every diagnosis has a severe impact. And we break this up particularly in adolescence because we want to know where we need to pay the most attention. And you'll notice that anxiety disorders are very common, but not so many of them have a severe impact. Compared to substance use disorders, we just put a not applicable in the severe impact, because if you meet criteria for a substance use disorder during adolescence, that is having a severe impact. There's too much development going on when you're a kid. You'll also notice that when we look at kids, we really sort of break things broadly into categories. It's much harder to create a specific diagnosis when somebody is growing and developing, because oftentimes we don't know what that's going to be until later. And oftentimes people show warning signs of diagnoses that turn out to not become a diagnosis later on. And so we think about categories of challenges, but half of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by the age of 14. Anxiety disorders, the average age at which an anxiety disorder starts is age 11. The average age at which depression starts is age 32. Why the difference? I'll give you a hint.
Anxiety leads to depression.
Well, lots of different things lead to depression. Anxiety disorders often get wired in early because our fight or flight response gets set at a different place. Versus depression can be caused by things like loss. And loss happens more often later in life. And so the average age, depression onsets at any point in life, and so the average age is higher, whereas anxiety disorders usually start in childhood. That's not a hard and fast rule, but that is a general rule. Here's what depression looks like in adolescence. This is, again, 12 months, and you'll notice right away that women in adolescence are much more likely to have challenges with depression than men do. But for both age group or both genders, for both men and women, the risk of depression goes up as you go through adolescence. Oh, I went twice. All right, so let's talk about normal adolescent development, shall we? I'm just gonna, this isn't one that blacks it out, so you're just gonna have to pretend that screen's not up there. What happens during adolescence, right? Brain chemicals change, absolutely. So you get this flood of hormones, we call them sex hormones, and that triggers a lot of development in your body, but it is more than getting your body ready to pass DNA on to the next generation, right? It's more, this is a shock? Adolescence is about more, and puberty is about more than just turning you into an adult who can have children. It turns out that your brain also undergoes a lot of changes during adolescence, right? And new pathways form, and you get this explosion of neurons. You actually add a lot of brain cells during adolescence, and that forms a prefrontal cortex. What else changes?
I think it goes along with what you're saying. You start realizing how different you are from your parents.
Oh my goodness, yes. You're like, I will be completely different than my parents, right? What else?
And then you do the exact same thing.
And then you wind up looking exactly the same way. Like in your 40s, you look in the mirror and you're like, hi, Dad. Hypothetically speaking. What else? A lot of physical changes. A lot of mood changes, absolutely. In fact, the part of your brain that does a rich mood experience and rich emotional experience develops more quickly than your prefrontal cortex, which means during adolescence, we feel emotions quicker than we think, and we feel them super intensely. So it really is the end of the world when she breaks up with you. It really is the best day ever when you win that race. What else? The way that we rank authority changes during adolescence. During childhood, parents, grown-ups, teachers, we tend to take what they say, and we tend to trust them unless it's been really terribly gone sideways. And our wiring in our brain changes differently, and suddenly our peers, our friends, become the most important authorities in our lives. And we start to question our parents, and we start to question our pastors and our teachers and our Pathfinder leaders and our government authority figures and whatever else. And we start to maybe think about the world in our own way and think about what we want. What else? We try new things. We try on new identities. Sometimes we try on new identities every day. What else? We begin to figure out who we are as a person. And we begin to make choices in our lives about what direction we're going to go. And we begin to think about longer term. Women do this more quickly than men. No shock to those of you who work with high school students. But it turns out that adolescence happens more quickly for women, or at least they work through it more quickly than men do. For women, we used to say that adolescence is pretty well done by your early 20s, and for men, mid-20s. We now know that that's being a little aggressive. It may be 30s. For both, to be fair, for both. Maybe it's mid-20s for women and 30s for men. The truth is your prefrontal cortex continues to grow and develop for the rest of your life, or continues to change and develop for the rest of your life. But we sort of check off adolescence in your mid-20s and we say, congratulations, you've made it to being an adult. All right, do I press a button or do you press a button to turn it back on? Oh, I do. I have the power. All right, so the question is, and this is, I'm just going to give you a tip, those of you that are Pathfinder staff. If you forget what adolescence was like, just ask somebody nearby you. See, the thing is we all make this interesting error in judgment. All of us assume that the way we see the world and the way we process information and the way we make decisions is about the same way that everybody else does. And so if you just understood what I understood, you would see how I'm right. And what I'm telling you is that adult brains work differently than adolescent brains. I know, right? It explains a lot of things. And the difficult thing is, as adults, we forget that. And we expect the people that we work with, we expect adolescents, I expect my students to be like adults. But your brain is literally just being built.
Yeah, Johnny.
And I have to remember that I don't think that way. Let me give you a very simple example. Did you know that the rate at which your neurons fire, the rate at which information flows in your head, slows down as you go through life? Shocker, right? But we've measured this now. And the difference between, if I ask you to close your eyes and count out 60 seconds, to count out 1 minute, don't worry, we're not going to do it. In your 20s, you'll probably be pretty close, plus or minus 5 seconds. In your 60s, it's more like 90 seconds. Your brain firing rate slows down by about 50%. Which is part of the reason why time seems to go faster, because you're not sampling the world as often as you are when you're younger. And so things really do come at you a little bit more quickly. Now, we don't notice this because it doesn't change overnight, right? It's just and so if you practice counting out 60 seconds with your eyes closed every day, you will still be pretty accurate when you get to your 60s. So it's not irrevocable, but it does, and it doesn't necessarily make a dramatic difference in driving, because you've got experience that makes up for the decrease in reaction time, right? So we all do okay, but our brains fundamentally work differently, and we have different, we subscribe to different authorities, and we process emotions differently, and we think about the future differently, and all of that. So the question is, if to us grown-ups, adolescence looks a lot like a mental illness because we really don't understand it anymore, even though we think we do because we went through it ourselves, how do we as grown-ups do a better job of recognizing the difference between normal, typical adolescence and when something starts to be maybe just a little bit concerning? And that's what I want to talk about tonight. For those of us who are still in adolescence, feel free to tell me when I'm getting it completely wrong, because although I swore that I would never, A, be out of touch, never B, be uncool, and C, never forget what it's like to be an adolescent, guess what? Time's starting to get me. All right, so signs and symptoms fall into a broad variety of categories, but we're going to look at those categories that we talked about earlier. We're going to look about physical sort of stuff, like behavioral kinds of things. We're going to look at thinking or psychological kinds of things, and we're going to look at emotional kinds of signs as well, okay? So let's talk about some physical signs and symptoms. They run the gamut. If you can think about physical signs and symptoms, there are lots of things that might be related to a mental health condition. I want to be very clear, not a single one of these things is diagnostic of a mental illness. But if somebody develops a new onset of pounding heart and chest pain and maybe a hot flush, that might be a sign of an anxiety disorder. So it might be a time for us to be curious. Ditto with respiratory or odd neurologic things. Right? So these could be something significant, or they could be absolutely nothing. But these are times when we might want to begin to get just a little bit curious about what's happening. We can also look at other kinds of behavioral things like pattern adjustments. If somebody's eating schedule changes, if somebody's sleeping schedule changes, if somebody's appearance changes, if they go from being somebody who's relatively well kept to somebody who is not taking care of their physical appearance at all, that's a great time to be curious. If somebody flips the other direction and goes from somebody who generally doesn't care how they look to suddenly somebody who is very, very particular about how they look, that might be a great time to be curious about why things changed. It might be because somebody's trying on a new identity, and that is totally normal and absolutely okay. It might also be a sign of something else going on, okay? There's also, we don't talk probably enough about this in adolescence. We kind of write it off as this whole hormonal storm and people are going to change and everything's going to be different. But the truth is that mental health challenges can affect that. And it can affect things like menstrual cycle in women or nocturnal emissions in men, interest in sex, interest in building relationships and those kinds of things. And so if somebody is maybe winding up in a different place than their peers, it's worth thinking about. let's talk about some emotions as well. These are ones that are generally easier to recognize, but can be tough because remember, adolescence is kind of a turbulent time with emotions. And so if somebody is sad, that's fine. But if somebody is stuck in a depressed mood, that might be a time to pay attention. If somebody has guilt that is far out of proportion of whatever's happening in their life, that might be a time to pay attention. Excessive irritability or anger, decreased inhibition, decreased emotions. Somebody's emotions flatline. That's generally surprising during adolescence. It's normal for adolescents to be sensitive to criticism. But if that sensitivity suddenly spikes, that might be a time to pay attention. Just going to flip through all of these. Oh.
Question.
Yes.
How does this change as culture and society changes?
Oh, it totally does. So,
sensitivity, for instance.
I'm sorry?
So, for instance, sensitivity today seems to be a little higher than it was a couple decades ago. Does the measurement change, or does the diagnosis stay stable?
So, our understanding of mental health diagnoses has changed. For those of you who didn't hear the question, society thinks about things differently than we used to. And one of the things that some people feel has happened is that we are now perhaps more sensitive than we used to be. And so does that mean fewer people, I want to make sure that I'm understanding this right, but does that mean that fewer people might meet criteria for a diagnosis because being more sensitive is now a cultural phenomenon, not something outside of the norm? And the short answer to that is, if you go to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, they will say that one of the things that is necessary for a diagnosis is that it cannot be a cultural norm. So we would not diagnose the entire country of Norway as having schizoid personality disorder, because being a little more emotionally withdrawn is kind of a cultural norm. We used to joke when I was in training that we wouldn't diagnose anybody in Taos with schizotypal personality disorder because crystals are magic there. That's just the way things are, and the world works differently, and so that's just normal. So I would say yes, what we're looking for is people who fall outside of that bell curve of where their peers are. That's really what we're looking for, is people who are starting to settle out towards the edges, and that's really more of a time to be worried. All right. Obsessive or compulsive behavior, I just want to define that very clearly. We joke about OCD a lot in our society. Obsessions are thoughts that you are compelled to think, and compulsions are activities that you are compelled to do. And so if somebody is stuck in a repeating pattern of, I have to wash my hands 5 times before I eat, or I must always put my socks on in precisely the same way, or things like that, that's a time to pay attention. And that's what we mean by obsessive or compulsive behavior. Not necessarily. You might just be very efficient. But if those obsessive or compulsive behaviors are now interfering with your ability to function, then maybe that's a time to be able to pay attention. If you have to spend 3 hours every day putting on your socks, we should probably talk. That's right. My email's at the end, don't worry. All right, let's talk about thinking. These things are sort of tough, but frequent self-criticism or self-blame, absolutely. Pessimism, always looking on the downside or the dark side of things. Difficulty making decisions. We forget that this is a really common manifestation of both depression and anxiety. It becomes really, really hard to make a final decision on something. And so it's normal to be nervous about choosing what college you might go to or which high school classes you might take, and you might be right up to the deadline, but it's having a hard time figuring out what you're going to eat for lunch because you just can't decide. That's maybe problematic. Rigid thinking. During adolescence is an incredible time of enormous flexibility in thinking as we sort of try to figure out the world. And so somebody who's stuck in only being able to think about things one way is a great time to pay attention. I want to talk briefly about psychotic symptoms as well, because there's some words on here. Delusions versus hallucinations. Well, this says delusions or hallucinations. What is a delusion?
Well, delusions of grandeur is the thing.
Delusions of grandeur is a thing. What is a delusion of grandeur?
When you just kind of, pretty sure it's when you feel just a general sense of you are more important than other people.
Yeah. So delusions of grandeur might mean that I imagine myself to be far more important than I really am. I am, in fact, the best mental health speaker ever in the world. And nothing that you can tell me will persuade me otherwise. You might consider that to be a delusion of grandeur. I would just say it's the truth. But that's because I'm suffering from a delusion of grandeur, right? So a delusion is a textbook clinical thing. It is a fixed, false belief. In truth, they're not quite as fixed and often not quite as false as we would imagine them to be. But the textbook definition is a fixed, false belief. So it is a belief that you have for which nobody else can find any evidence. Does that make sense? A hallucination, on the other hand, is a sensory experience without stimulus. For the person experiencing a hallucination, it is very real. They are actually smelling something. They are actually seeing something. They are actually hearing something or feeling it or whatever else. And their brain is firing off. If I stuck them in a functional MRI machine, their brain would be firing off. The sensory cortex in their brain that corresponds with that sense would be firing off. They are actually seeing something. It is not made up. But there is nothing triggering it. That is different than an illusion. An illusion is a sensory misperception, and we all do this. You walk into the room at the end of the day, you say hello to your cat does not respond appropriately, you look over, and it's your bag that you left in the corner, and you're just grateful that your roommate did not see you say hello to your book bag, right? This happens all the time. You're walking through a crowd, you hear your name, nobody said your name, your brain just heard enough, something that sounded close enough to your name that it was like, I know that, bing, and it interpreted it as your name. We all do this all the time. That is not generally concerning. The truth is we all hallucinate all the time as well. You don't believe me? At the back of your eyeball, where your optic nerve inserts into the retina, there are no photoreceptors. There is no ability for you to sense light at that part of your eyeball. But you don't walk around with big holes in your vision. Your brain just borrows from what's around there and fills it in. This is why you got to look over your shoulder before you change lanes and things like that, because if you just glance back with your eye, you might never see the motorcyclist or the car that's there. Don't believe me? Let's do a little experiment. Stick your hands out in front of you. Don't poke anybody. And look straight ahead. Just look straight ahead and slowly move your fingers out to the side. Somewhere about out here, your fingers will briefly disappear and then reappear. Did you see it? Well, that'll give you something fun to do a little bit later. The whole evening, people are going to be walking around doing the... Just don't run into anything. I will get into big trouble, okay? And it's hard to see because it just blips out for a second because your brain suddenly is just borrowing from the surrounding information. It doesn't see the finger, and so it just maps it in with everything's out. It just quickly blips out and then comes right back. And you kind of have to move your finger not too slow and not too fast to do it. So we're all constantly seeing things that aren't actually there, and that's not necessarily problematic. About 15% of us have auditory hallucinations pretty regularly, and we just don't tell people about them because they'll think we're crazy. So I want to be clear, none of these things is in and of itself diagnostic. In fact, half of us think the other half of the country is delusional every election, right? So we don't think about delusions as being group things, they're individual things. So what we want to do when we recognize these things that might be warning signs is we want to think about, is this causing problems? So if we see something, again, I'll say it again, if we see something that we think might be a warning sign of a mental health condition, stop and ask yourself, how's this person doing? How are they doing in school? How are they doing in their social settings? How are they doing in their other daily activities, the instruments they love to play or the sports they love to do or whatever else? And if everything is going pretty well okay, great. Maybe flag it, maybe keep an eye, maybe check in later and see how they're doing, but you don't have to worry about that. If the ability to live, laugh, or love is starting to slip, Now we need to pay attention. All right? That is my best rule of thumb for how to tell the difference between typical adolescence and all of the crazy things that happen and when maybe we need to start paying even more attention. So let me give you a couple of examples. It is entirely normal, as somebody observed earlier, for people to withdraw from their parents, or maybe even from former friends, as they hit adolescence. But withdrawing from everything, that's not typical. It is very common to choose to spend time with different people, but not considered normal adolescence to completely stop spending time with everybody. It is totally normal to want more privacy. It's a classic sign of adolescence. The sign goes up on the door, nobody can come into my room without knocking, right? Or whatever else. Totally normal. But not so normal to become secretive about everything in one's life. Not so normal to be hiding things, but normal to want more space and more privacy. Totally typical to stop liking Thomas the Train and start liking... What?
It's Thomas the Tank Engine.
I am so sorry. I got nothing. I messed up. Totally fine to keep liking Thomas the Tank Engine as well. But that like should get replaced with something else. People change interests. It would be concerning if somebody stopped being interested in anything. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the things that fall a little bit outside. Any questions about how to tell the difference between typical adolescence and mental health concerns? You're all experts now, right? No. The rule of thumb, remember, is if you see something that you're like, I don't know what to do with that, to step back a moment and ask yourself, how is this person doing in everything in their life? Okay? Let's talk about risk factors for developing mental illnesses. What kinds of things, I mean, you can read off the list if you want, but let me ask you, what kinds of things do you already know about that increase somebody's risk of developing a mental health condition? Abuse, trauma, parental divorce, separation, what? Yeah, if somebody's already sort of somebody who worries about everything else, the chance that that could spiral into something is higher. What else? Physical. Oh, yes, physical trauma, absolutely. Being in an accident or getting a head injury, particularly, there, it's right at the bottom. What else? There was something of loss of anything. Loss of a pet, loss of parents, loss of friends, loss of, well, anything. Girls? Did somebody say girls? Well, it turns out that navigating social relationships is incredibly stressful. And so getting your heart broken or being rejected by a social group that you're trying to become a part of absolutely can cause challenges. What else?
I'm just clarifying, like something like an accident, you said brain injury, things like that, but along with that and other things, you can get PTSD, which is more mental, where you can't stop obsessing about.
Yeah, one mental health condition that can develop after a physical trauma is PTSD. Absolutely.
Or severe emotional traumas, PTSD can also develop after that.
Yep. Turns out the trauma doesn't have to be physical to develop PTSD. Bullying, absolutely. What else? Diet. What an interesting question. Diet does predispose us. We're going to talk a little bit more about that tomorrow when we talk about how to take care of ourselves, but I'll give you the short version. In general, the more plant-based and the more whole your diet is, the more whole food-based it is, not the grocery chain, but actual whole foods like the carrots we had at lunch today and the tomatoes and whatever else, the less like you are to have challenges with depression. The more animal-based and the more processed your diet is, the more likely you are to have challenges with depression. It is not a guarantee, but it is. And periods of starvation in society show an increased risk of schizophrenia about 20 years later. So there's something about moms and their nutrition when they're pregnant that influences risk of mental health later on. We know that's true for women in depression as well.
So the woman that is pregnant?
So it gets complicated, But your mother's nutrition when she was pregnant with you affects your risk of depression during adolescence. But if you think about it, when did your mother develop all of her eggs? Well, she was developing in her mother's womb, so your grandmother's nutrition totally affects your risks. It's complicated stuff. So lots of things can do this. Medication side effects, absolutely. Did you know common cold medicines increase your risk of suicidal thinking? Yes. Yeah, it's not even on the label, but it's true.
Severe family health crisis.
Absolutely. Any sort of a significant disruption in the family, like a health crisis, your genetics absolutely plays a role. If there's a mental illness that runs in your family, chances are your risk of that is much higher. It depends a little bit on the mental illness.
What about schizophrenia? Is that true for schizophrenia?
It is true for schizophrenia, but it's not a guarantee. So if I look at twin studies, you guys know the difference between identical twins and so-called fraternal twins? Identical twins have a lot of genetic overlap. They're not perfectly identical, but they're very close, right? And so the percentage, if you develop schizophrenia, your identical twin is at very high risk of developing schizophrenia. But it's not 100%. If you are fraternal twins, the risk is higher, but not much higher than if you are just siblings. If you are siblings, it's definitely higher. If you have a first-degree relative, it's higher. But that's maybe closer to 10%. Environment really matters. As long as we're talking about schizophrenia, an interesting study out of Scandinavia, I'm going to mess this up, but my memory is telling me it was Denmark, looked at adoption. And they looked at children who were adopted from high stress to high stress environments, high stress to low stress to high stress, and low stress to low stress. And what they found was really interesting. If you are born into a high-stress environment and adopted into a high-stress environment, your risk of developing schizophrenia is about 9 times higher than if you're born into a low-stress and adopted into a low-stress environment. The other two directions are somewhere in the middle. So there's something about schizophrenia is not exclusively a genetic disease. There's something about environment as well, and that's probably true for most mental health conditions. You might inherit a predisposition to that, but something has to happen to really unmask that or trigger that. I'll give you an example with depression as well, major depressive disorder. One of the things that we know that can increase your genetic risk for major depressive disorder is the gene that encodes for a serotonin transporter. It's a little vacuum that sucks serotonin back up into the neuron so it can be repackaged and reused. And if you there's 2 main types of that gene, and you inherit 1 allele from each parent. And the good one is the long allele, and the one that increases your risk for depression is a short allele. So if you inherit 2 long alleles, one great serotonin transporter gene from each parent, your risk of developing depression, a major depressive episode over the course of your life is pretty low, less than 10%. Pretty small. If you inherit 2 short alleles, you maybe should have chosen your parents better, and also your risk of developing a major depressive disorder at some point in your life is more like 80%. But notice neither one of those is a guarantee. So it's more complicated than that. It's a combination of genes and environment. The things that protect you then, the kind of environment that's ideal to grow up in, are things like this. An environment in which you have high self-esteem, in which you have a healthy lifestyle, in which you've developed good problem-solving skills, you're in control of your life, you have an active spiritual life, you avoid substances, you have a very consistent family life, a family that you can count on, and a routine you can count on, and somebody is checking in on your activities, and you stick with school and in attendance and the things you do, and you have a really great social network, and I mean an in-person social network, and you don't have to worry about where your food is coming from next. I got to say something about this for 2 more minutes. If you'll forgive my sense of humor, the number one thing you can do that you have control over to protect your mental health is don't be poor. And if you do have to be poor for as short a time as possible and stop being poor as soon as you absolutely can and go back to being wealthy. It turns out that, all kidding aside, that it really, really matters whether or not you have resources. And if you're somebody who has had the luck or the misfortune of having economic challenges, your risk of all kinds of physical conditions and mental health conditions goes up pretty dramatically.
Does that change if you are extremely wealthy?
No. I know that the people who have a lot of money like to say more money, more problems. But the truth is, if you can be up at the top of the socioeconomic pillar, you are much likely to live longer and stay healthier, in part because if something does go sideways, you can totally afford to get the best care in the world for it. And you don't have to make tough choices.
What about military brats with just kids that moved around a lot growing up?
I think it depends a lot on who the person is and what their family structure is like and what sorts of things happen to them. Plenty of us move around a lot and do okay. And plenty of us have a lot of challenges because we never got to develop sustained relationships. So I think it really varies.
So I got a question before you get too far away from the last thing you were talking about.
The risk factors, yeah.
And you said depression. What do you call it when it's a diagnosis?
A mental illness, sure, or a disorder.
So that's been a question always in my mind. What is a disorder? Does that mean like it's physically, like it's in your body, you don't have any control over it, it has to be dealt with medication or whatever? I mean, what's the... Because I mean, we all, have days where we're depressed or this or that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when does it become like a medical condition according to the medical world?
So we describe, because there's so much that we're still learning about mental illness, we describe mental illness in terms of clusters of identifiable symptoms, signs, and symptoms. So things that you notice about yourself or things that I notice about you. And we lump them together that way. And we don't think of them as disorders unless they're significantly interfering with somebody's ability to function. Usually there's a time amount associated with that as well. 2 weeks or a month or 2 years. It depends on the diagnosis. And so does that mean it's something in your body that there's nothing you can do about? Absolutely not. There's all kinds of things you can do. And we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow as well. So I hope you, I know it's early, it's like 7:30, but I hope you'll be here. Is it 7:30 or 7? 7:30, right? All right. So we'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow, but I happen to be somebody who believes there's always something that can be done. Some of us will have challenges for a very long time, and we might have to learn to live with the challenges that we have. And some of us will be able to completely experience a complete resolution of whatever the challenge is. So.
I just asked, I don't know if I asked it right, but some people, they just automatically say, oh, yes, I've got this disorder, and it's like, okay, I need a doctor now, or I need drugs now, or whatever, when it could be just a period of life they're in, or a phase, or whatever. Is there like a medical, like, okay, you've crossed this line, so now you have to have medical treatment versus just...
I think for me, the line, and medical treatment is a tough term. I will confess that I don't know exactly what to do with that. But I would say that if whatever's going on for you is interfering with your ability to live, laugh, or love in a significant way, then it's time to pay attention to that. And there might be a variety of ways to address that. Some of those are things like therapy or medications, but we seldom start with medications. I personally don't think that medications are the answer to everything, but boy, do they save lives sometimes. And so they might be necessary. But I don't know how to tell that without knowing the specifics of a person in front of me. Sometimes we can solve things with a lot of other things. So I'm sorry, I wish I had a more clear answer for you. It's a very big question that you've asked, and it's a very important thing. And one of the things that I find myself talking about a lot is this sort of magic line of mental illness. We don't know exactly where it is, but we do seem to agree that there's a line somewhere that on one side you don't have a mental illness and on the other side you do. But it's a very fuzzy line. I agree. Got time for a couple more questions and then we've got to move on because I promised some solutions and we are running low on time. Yes?
Quickly, is there a difference between mental disorder and mental illness? Or is it just...
Those are interchangeable terms. Mental disorder and mental illness are interchangeable. Yeah. It's sort of,
Depends on the context of the sentence.
depends on the context of the sentence, depends on the author, depends on who's talking at any given moment, but you can think of them as being interchangeable. Yes?
So when it comes to mental disorders and some other things, I just forgot it.
That's okay. Well, perhaps it'll come back up. And be any other, right here.
When dealing with our kids, so like my biological kids versus my adopted children and pathfinders.
Sure.
I have a little more say and control
in my home, if I see concerns and, you know, getting help, choosing to get help for my kids or whatever, as opposed to if I see areas of concern with my kids and Pathfinders, how do you broach that with them, their parents, if you're seeing consistent concerns that, you know, you're leading into possible mental illness or stuff like that, that they could use help for, maybe the parents aren't seeing that or whatever.
I promise we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but how do you intervene? Well, I think one of the things that you have to do, and I'm going to shamelessly advance here. Oh, I do want to say one thing before I answer your question. It's all right. Wow, I'm going the wrong direction. That feels not unfamiliar. There we go. Notice that I've chosen to highlight one thing here. The thing that most predicts the successful navigation of adolescence is a young person having just one adult in their life that they believe is interested in them and has their back. And that doesn't have to be a parent, and it doesn't have to be you. It could be you as a Pathfinder staff member, it could be a teacher, it could be somebody else or whatever else. But that, if I'm looking through all the data, that is the thing that is most helpful, and that is part of the reason why I talk about this in these kinds of environments, because we can totally help. We can do that. And let's talk about ways to help. Did you remember your question?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
So when it comes to mental disorders,
Uh-huh.
before I forget anything, as a medical professional, is it sometimes hard when looking at medications, and sometimes you have to just shoot in the dark because you don't know exactly what's going on?
I would not say that I shoot in the dark. What I would say is that we as medical professionals make educated guesses and we learn from them. My favorite TV show about this is House MD. It's not the world's best TV show. I want to be clear. I am a fan of Hugh Laurie, but it's not the world's greatest TV show. But one thing that I really appreciate about that show is this team of brilliant experts gets it wrong 3 or 4 times before they get it right. But every time they get it wrong, they learn something from that, and that helps them get closer to the truth. And I think that's what happens a lot in mental health, right? So, yes?
And then people change. They grow, they change.
Absolutely.
My daughter-in-law has bipolar, and she keeps having to change medication because she's getting older.
So our bodies change, and the way we respond to things change. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think we're probably not going to have time to talk about the specific things unless somebody authorizes me to go over, but I want to talk about somebody who has the ability to authorize me to go over. I really need to choose my words more carefully with you guys. That's a teddy bear.
It's Pastor Richie.
It's a teddy bear with a tag that says Pastor Richie. I am having a terrible time with the control. All right, so I think the first thing you got to do is think about what your role is, right? So it's different if you're a parent or if you're somebody's clergy, if you're their teacher or whatever else. And what I want to tell you is I am not authorizing you to be a superhero this evening. You'll have to get your cape somewhere else. But I am telling you that it's okay to be curious about people, and it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to say to somebody's parent, I've observed this, this, and this, and I'm not an expert, but it makes me worried about this. And I'm wondering if you guys have thought about these kinds of resources that might be available to you. So I think that's what I would do. And I do this all the time as I refuse to be a psychiatrist when I'm not, in my office and being a formal psychiatrist. So I don't sit down and do psychiatric evaluations with people, but I might say, ooh, yeah, what you're talking about sounds like that could be a challenge. And here's the kinds of things that you might want to think about asking, or the kinds of people that you might want to talk to about that, okay? Do be aware of what the mandatory reporting laws are in wherever you are. No knowledge that you have somehow supplants mandatory reporting laws, all right? So if a kid comes to you and says, I want to tell you about what's going on with me, and I want to tell you why I'm having such a hard time, but you have to promise to keep it a secret, you get to say, I will keep as much of it a secret as I can, but there are some things that I cannot keep a secret.
And they'll respect you more for saying that to them than saying, oh yeah, sure, no problem.
I
Say, I will not, if you say, I will not keep a secret, I'm not allowed to, they will respect it. May change what they tell you, or if they tell you at all, but they will still respect you for doing that.
I'm a huge believer in giving people the lay of the land, right? And saying, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do, and I can't keep a secret. Yep, absolutely. Do you think about the privacy rights? I don't know the law here in Idaho, so I apologize, but in Oregon, we have a sort of a funny cutoff at age 14, where at age 14, a person can begin to consent for their own mental health treatment, but you still have to notify their parents, unless notifying their parents would result in greater harm to the person. And so it's a little bit squishy and weird until somebody gets to 18, and then you no longer have to notify parents. Right? So keep in mind the laws around wherever you are, and think about when it is you must communicate with somebody's guardian or parent or whatever else about what's going on. I think we probably have to cut it off here, so I'll see if I can squeeze some of these things in tomorrow. That's where we've got to stop tonight. Thank you, everybody, for riding along with me. I'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning.
I don't know how you do it, but that's a lot of information and fun. That's a rare combination, some of these topics. Appreciate that. So we went, it was your permission, we went a little overtime here. Yeah. So why don't we do this, because I'm feeling like it would be good for me to move just a little. My watch says 5:23. Why don't we say we'll be back here and start at 5:30? So that's a fairly serious backing up, but I think we'll be okay. So be back in here, stand up, get a drink, run around, celebrate the clouds. What? I set my... No. So we'll see you back here in about 7 minutes, okay?